Hello, my name is Marie Denon and I work with Big Green. Congratulations, you have received a learning garden at your school. This learning garden installation presentation is part one of a two-part series, and this presentation will go through everything you need to know to set up your garden space and install your garden at your school. This presentation provides pictures, videos, and text instructions, along with my narration that will help you through the entire process. After you go through this presentation, you will be able to access the video recording to go back to on your own so you can rewatch and fast forward and rewind as needed to help you install your garden. This presentation will walk you through 3 steps to help you install your garden. The first is what you can expect to be delivered to your school, which includes your garden beds and soil. The second is helping you think through and identify the best location for your garden, as well as how to design your garden beds in the space. And the third will show you how to drill holes for both securing and bolting your beds together, and also how to drill holes to install your drip line irrigation system. This section will go over the products you will be receiving, as well as important safety tips and what tools you will need to install your garden. Your garden beds and soil will be delivered and dropped off in the location that you identified and shared with Big Green ahead of time. The soil will be dropped on 1 or 2 pallets, depending on the size of your learning garden. Keep in mind that a pallet can hold up to 50 bags of soil, and you will be receiving soil bags that are either 1.5 cubic feet or 2 cubic feet per bag. Your garden beds will be delivered by either a moving company whom you can direct to place the beds where you want them, or they will be dropped off on a pallet and you will need to place the beds where you want them yourself. The pallets will be wrapped with plastic, and you can use a utility knife or sharp scissors to cut through the plastic and unwrap the bags or the beds when you need them. Make sure to be careful not to cut through the bags or into the garden beds when you are cutting the plastic off. Before you get started, it is important to think about the safety of moving garden beds and soil in your space, and to set some ground rules for any students, adults, or volunteers helping you. Make sure you bend and lift with your legs and not with your back when lifting the soil in garden beds. Stronger students and adults might be able to carry soil independently. You can also use a wheelbarrow to move a few bags of soil at once. This also might make moving soil a little bit easier for your school community. Generally, 2 adults or a small team of 2 to 4 students will be needed to carry the garden beds. Before you move anything, take notice of how heavy the beds and soil are for you and your helpers, and make a plan and strategy that works best for your school. Lastly, there is drilling required to install your garden beds. This should only be done by adults or trained high school students. You will need to assemble some tools that will help you drill holes to secure the garden beds to each other, and also for your drip line irrigation system. These are all tools that are not too difficult to find. Your school facilities manager should have these tools, and if not, you might be able to find someone to borrow them from. The tools include a utility knife or heavy-duty scissors. These can be used to unwrap the plastic off of your pallets and also to help cut open your soil bags. You will need a drill that will be used to drill holes for the bolts and also for your irrigation drip line. You will need a 1/4-inch diameter drill bit. This drill bit will be used to drill the holes for your bolts that will secure your beds together. You will also need a drill bit that will allow you to make a hole that is at least 3/4 of an inch in diameter. This hole will be used for you to lay your drip line irrigation in your garden. There are different types of drill bits that you can use to make this 3/4 inch diameter hole. And those include a standard drill bit that's at least 3/4 of an inch or bigger. You can use a paddle bit that is 3/4 of an inch or bigger. You can use a hole dozer, and you can also use a step drill bit. The next thing you will need is an adjustable wrench that can grab onto the nut of a bolt. This will help you tighten the bolts when you're securing your beds together. You will need a number 2 Phillips head screwdriver. This will also help you tighten the bolts. And you might need 2 6-inch medium trigger clamps. If the ground surface you're placing the beds on is uneven, especially if you're putting your garden on grass, the clamps will allow you to really hold the beds next to each other evenly, which will ensure that where you drill your holes is in a location that will allow you to easily stick in the bolts and also to lay your drip line irrigation. We highly recommend you attach adjoining garden beds together. This includes anywhere in your garden design where 2 beds are touching each other. You will need the bolts we gave you with your garden beds, and those screws, nuts, and washers are listed on this slide. Bolting your beds is an especially critical step when installing garden beds on uneven surfaces. Beds not bolted together will be uneven and crooked once they are filled with soil. We will come back to how to use the tools and how to drill the holes and install your bolts at the end of this presentation. This next section is very important, and it will go over how to pick the best location for your garden and how to help you think through the design you can create with your garden beds in your space. Connect with your school's garden team or planning committee and consider the following questions when deciding where to locate your learning garden on your school property. Number 1, is the surface flat? Number 2, is it close to a water source with constant availability? Number 3, will the area get 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight? And finally, who will use the learning garden? We will go over each question in detail in the following slides. Important for your learning garden. Identify areas on your school grounds that would be best suited for your garden. There are 4 types of surfaces that might already exist at your school that you can place your garden on. Gravel is a great surface that provides good drainage and is generally flat and pretty easy to maintain. Note that you might be pulling up some weeds and grass that grow through the gravel as you water your garden. Concrete and pavers are an excellent surface to place your garden. This type of surface is generally pretty level and flat. It is also generally ADA accessible, and you will have minimal maintenance to no maintenance in pulling up weeds and grass that might grow through. One thing to note is that water runoff that goes through your garden and through the soil in your garden might stain the concrete or pavers a little bit over time. Grass is also a good surface as long as it is relatively flat. Grass areas that are not flat might cause your garden beds to warp. You also want to be mindful of grassy areas that are mushy or areas that get very wet when it rains. As you water the garden, this could cause an issue with the surface being too wet for students and other members of your garden team to enjoy the garden if the ground is too mushy and wet. You will also need to work more closely with your grounds crew in making sure that the area is mowed and that you don't let the grass go to seed, as this can blow into your garden and cause a lot of grass to grow into your garden beds over time. The one surface I would not recommend is a dirt surface. The dirt will get very muddy when it rains, and it will also get very muddy when you water the garden, as there are drainage holes in the bottom of your garden beds that are important because they allow for proper drainage through the garden so your plants don't drown if the garden bed gets overwatered. Let's talk about water. Daily watering is essential during some parts of your growing season, and you want to make sure you find a location for your garden that is as close as possible to a water source. A water source that is close to your garden will also allow students to participate more easily in helping to water the garden. In my experience working with hundreds of schools with gardens, not having a water source near the garden that is easy to access is one of the biggest challenges schools face in maintaining a successful garden. If the water source is something you are unsure about, I suggest you walk around your entire schoolyard to locate outdoor water spigots and connect with your facilities manager about your water source options. Ideally, your water source is not more than 50 feet from your learning garden. If your water source is more than 50 feet from your garden, make sure you have a plan for how and where to store the hoses that will be connecting to your garden, as very long hoses can be a tripping hazard and also tend to have a greater likelihood of being damaged. Let's talk about sunlight. Most vegetable crops, especially summer crops, require 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight to produce well. If you only have a shady spot for your garden, you will need to plant shade-tolerant crops like greens, herbs, and some root vegetables. Don't expect large harvests of sun-loving crops like tomatoes, melons, cucumbers, corn, and peppers if there isn't ample sun where your garden will be growing. Look at your proposed site throughout the day and at different times of the year to see how the sun moves over the area. South-facing spaces are generally best if your garden will be near the side of a building. Remember, the sun is lower in the winter, so if your garden is to the north of a building, it might receive less sunlight in winter than in summer. If your garden is to the north of a deciduous tree, there will be less light in the summer and fall when the leaves fill the canopy, and more light in the winter and early spring after the leaves fall. Let's talk about who will use the garden. Think about how you want to use the garden with your students and school community. You might want to position the garden close to classrooms or a part of the school that makes it the most accessible for your students to access. If the garden will be used by the community or cared for by the community or volunteers, you will also want to think about the garden being located in a space that is easily accessible to more people than just your students. You also might want to think about evening and weekend activities that happen at your school that the garden could enrich if accessible. After you have picked the best location for your garden based on the surface, the sunlight, the water access, and how you plan to use the garden, the next step is to move your garden beds to your desired location. This slide includes some pictures and a video of high school students and a teacher carrying their garden beds to their garden spot. Make sure to follow the safety tip to bend at your knees and use your legs and not your back to pick up the garden beds when you move them to your desired location. Work with your team to design your garden. The garden beds are shapes that can be configured into many different designs. Use the personalized PowerPoint you were sent by Big Green, which has garden bed images for you to use to help design what you want the shape of your garden to look like. If you are planning to use the garden for outdoor education, I would recommend you have at least 2 sections of garden beds, so you can more easily break classes up into groups or stations while working in the garden. Once you are in the space, you will find that you might make adjustments to fit the garden into your space. Keep in mind where you expect students and people to congregate in the garden, and make sure to leave enough room for pathways that allowed for an easy flow in the garden. If you want to make sure your space is ADA accessible, there needs to be at least 32 inches between walkways and between the garden beds. This is a picture of a garden that has been placed in its final location. You will see how the ground is slightly uneven. The next part of this presentation will show you how to secure the beds together and drill holes for irrigation. The next section will show you step by step how to install the bolts and how to drill holes for your drip line irrigation system. If your garden beds are not lining up easily when you place them next to each other, it is recommended that you clamp the beds tightly together before drilling the holes for the bolts. This will ensure the holes are aligned when you drill them, which is very important when bolting the beds together. This is a critical step on slightly uneven or sloped surfaces. You can see in the picture that the clamps were needed to really squeeze the beds closer together. This will allow your garden to look nicer and also prevent warping over time when you put soil in the beds. If you are using clamps, remove them only after the holes are drilled and the bolts are securely connecting the beds. The next slide shows a short video of me using clamps to hold the beds together. If you can't access clamps, you could have adults holding the beds in place while you drill, although this might not provide the best results. The next set of slides will show you step by step how to drill the holes and how to bolt the beds together. You will need your drill with your 1/4-inch drill bit attached. Remember, you only need to bolt together the beds that are touching, and you always drill the holes for the bolts through both beds at the same time to make sure the holes are aligned on either side. The image on this slide shows you that you need to drill 4 holes, 1 in each corner of the garden beds. The holes closer to the top of the garden bed should be about 4 to 5 inches below the top, and the holes at the bottom can be drilled a couple of inches from the bottom of the bed. Make sure you hold the drill very straight and steady as you drill the holes. Watch the video on the next slide to see how easy it is to drill the holes through your garden beds. Once all 4 holes are drilled, you can follow these instructions to place the bolts in the holes. Remember, if you clamped the beds together, or if someone is helping you hold the beds together, don't remove them until after you secure the bolts. If you remove them, the beds will shift and it will be very difficult to line up the holes again. Watch the video on this slide, which will show you the order in which to place the washers and how to place the bolts in the beds. First, place a washer on the screw, then place the screw through the hole. Place another washer on the other side, and then place the nut on the end of the screw. Place all 4 bolts loosely in the holes before you tighten them. Once all the bolts are in the holes, you can use the Phillips head screwdriver and adjustable wrench to tighten the bolts down. As you tighten each bolt, you will notice the beds being brought closer together, and you might need to tighten the 4 bolts multiple times until they are all secure and not loose. Once you have bolted all the beds that are touching side by side together, the next step is to drill holes for the drip line irrigation. If you are not using drip line irrigation in your garden and you are only going to top water with a hose and nozzle, then you can skip this step. Although, if you think you might install drip line irrigation at some point, I would recommend you drill the holes because they are difficult to drill when you have soil already in the garden beds. You will need your drill and the 3/4-inch drill bit that you will be using. This could be a standard bit, a paddle bit, a hole dozer, or a step drill bit. You will be drilling 3 holes across the top of the garden bed, spaced evenly across and about 1 inch below the top of the garden bed, just under the lip. If your garden is bolted together, you no longer need clamps or assistance holding the beds together. If you did not bolt your beds together, you will need to use the clamps or have help holding the beds in place while drilling to make sure that the holes are lined up. Hold the drill very straight and steady when you're drilling. You might need to apply a lot of pressure forward on the drill for these holes to be made successfully. Depending on what type of drill bit you use, you might be able to drill through both sides together, but you might have to drill a hole on one side and then go to the other side and drill that same hole through the spot on the other side. The drill might jam up and stop along the way, and that is okay. Sometimes the plastic gets stuck in the drill bit and you have to clean it out, and sometimes the drill just gets overheated and jammed. Take a very short pause and keep trying until you make 3 holes across the top of the bed. There are 2 videos on this slide that show you how to drill the irrigation drip line holes, and I encourage you to watch them. This picture shows what the garden bed should look like after the 3 holes have been drilled for the drip line irrigation. You do not need to drill these 3 holes on an outer bed, only where there are 2 beds touching each other. As you drill holes in your garden beds, you will notice a lot of plastic debris falling into the bottom of the beds. Make sure to clean up these plastic pieces before moving on to the next step of installing your learning garden. This wraps up part 1 of your learning garden installation instructions. You should have identified your space, designed and placed your garden, and securely bolted your beds together, as well as drilling holes for your drip line irrigation system. Part 2 of the learning garden installation instructions will show you how to fill your garden beds with soil, how to lay down your drip line irrigation, and how to connect your irrigation to your water source. Stay tuned.